What's it like to work for Vladimir Putin? We speak to one Russian diplomat now in exile for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. Good evening. The war in Ukraine is entering a new era. This week, attacks on the capital, Kiev, have continued, and President Putin has ordered martial law in the areas of Ukraine now annexed by Russia. But does Putin have the support of his people? Boris Bondarev spent a decade working at the Russian Foreign Ministry, working as a diplomat in Switzerland. He put his life at risk and spoke out against the invasion and has spent the last 8 months in exile. Mr. Bondarev knows the inner workings of the Kremlin and what Putin could be planning next. Boris Bondarev, thank you so much for talking to us on Sky News today on the Beth Rigby interview show. I've got so much that I want to talk to you about, and I want to get into your time in Russia and working under President Putin. But first, you quit as a senior diplomat in May 2020 after 20 years working as a career diplomat, 3 months after the invasion of Ukraine. It was both, I would say, a brave but potentially dangerous thing for you to do. But you did it. Why?
Yes, I did quit from civil service in May 2022, though my decision was taken on February 24th, 2022, in the day when Russia illegally and unlawfully and unjustifiably attacked Ukraine. So for me, it was like a personal threshold, crossing which I realized that I could not any longer work for this government, for this regime, for this country, for my country, because my country now, under the leadership of President Putin and his accomplices, now is making war crimes and terrible mistakes and crimes against our future generations. Because now we see that Russia is going to be more and more isolated, is going more and more lost. And that is a terrible crime, huge crime, not only against Ukraine, but against Russians themselves.
Russian diplomats have been going around the world saying these are just training exercises on the border. There is no intention to invade. In the run-up to February the 24th, did you think President Putin is going to do this?
I personally did not believe that President Putin was seriously going to start the war. I told myself that it most probably it all was like a part of a huge diplomatic and political game. Like we concentrated our troops along the Ukrainian borders in order to press on Ukraine and on NATO to make some concessions and so on. So it's a huge and sometimes cruel, but it's still for politics. It's not the war. And so to the last day, I convinced myself that may not be so bad as it turned out to be. So yes, so the start of war was, a little bit unexpected to me.
So, Mr. Bondarev, when you saw that those tanks were going across the border, where were you at that moment, and how did you feel?
Well, I just woke up in my Geneva apartment. I turned to my smartphone just to check the news, and I saw all these footages of Kiev and Kharkiv bombed by Russian aircraft, and all these traffic jams of people trying to flee Kiev. It was terrible. The last time Kiev was bombed by the Nazi Luftwaffe in 1941. And it was unimaginable for me as a Russian who was born in the Soviet Union, to imagine that Russia may attack Ukraine, our closest neighbor. It's it's like England attacks Scotland, nowadays. I don't think you can imagine that. And then I understood that it is the beginning of the end of Putin government, of Putin regime.
I want to come on to the beginning of the end for Putin and all of that later in the interview, but you then defected effectively. Were you afraid?
Well, yes, I was a little bit afraid because, I had some familiar affairs to be settled before I could quit. Those time was very tense for me, and when every day I came to my office and I talk to people there whom I considered to be reasonable and professional. And after the war started, they all turned out to be like warmongering and very content with what was going on. And it was very hard to endure those conversations.
But just to be clear, do you think you will ever be able to now go back to Russia? Certainly not for the foreseeable future. You would not be safe, would you?
I don't think it would be okay for me to go back to Russia while the current government is in place. If there are some changes in Russia, of course, and Mr. Putin is gone, as we all hope it will not take long. So then, yes, I think I will go back, of course, because it's my home country. If I can be useful, I can be useful there.
There have been a number of deaths linked to the Kremlin, famously Alexander Litvinenko. It's thought at least 8 Russian businessmen have died in apparent suicides or accidents in just 6 months. I put it to you, you're a very brave man.
I don't think much about this, and I do not overestimate my importance. I'm just a middle level diplomat. Maybe I'm only one who resigned publicly, but anyway, it's not that I'm not a very important figure in Russian government, so to speak, in most general sense.
It must be very few people speak out against the regime, don't they? And there's a reason for that.
I believe that most people are either blindly believing that President Putin and his government are right and are doing the right thing, or they just don't want to be bothered, with any thoughts about what is going on. They just doing their job in the narrow sense of this word. So it's many people, they do the job, but they don't want to be, distracted from their day-to-day routine, because to be distracted to analyze the reality would take you a lot of your internal strength and capacity, and it may be very tiresome for you. And people don't want to get tired because daily life in Russia gets worse and worse every day, and you have to have your own strength. So I can understand those people. And also for many years, for decades, Russian civil service has been recruited. People for civil service have been recruited on the criteria of personal loyalty, and mostly not on the criterion of professionalism and competence.
Basically, people that would challenge or question get removed or leave the structures in Russia, in the sense that you end up with a president where no one actually speaks truth to power at all.
Well, yeah. I think if there were people in Russian government, close to President Putin, who could voice their concerns regarding some decisions, we may not see this very tragic situation. But evidently, there are no such people there. And last time I remember, it was in 2018 when there was this Libyan crisis. Yes, and there was an opposition within the MFA to the decision of no-fly zone over Libya. And this opposition was suppressed by government, by then President Dmitry Medvedev. And after that, I haven't seen any other more or less formal opposition within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to any government decision or proposal.
Let's get on to policy and President Putin now. Up until this year, you worked for the Russian Foreign Ministry and you served as an advisor on nuclear non-proliferation. Can you just explain what your job was to our viewers?
I worked in Geneva since 2019 in our disarmament team. So we mostly were in charge of conference on disarmament and all other disarmament-related matters which are discussed in Geneva, such as nuclear non-proliferation treaty, such as the Biological Weapons Convention and some other multilateral instruments. And also we dealt with the strategic stability.
On the issue of nuclear deterrence, it seems that Putin is more interested now in the threat of using nuclear weapons and deploying them than he is in non-proliferation. That is so clear. There have been reports that he wants to detonate potentially a nuclear warhead over the Black Sea. What do you think's going on?
I believe that there can be some plans to somehow employ the nuclear weapons during this the war in Ukraine. I cannot say, of course, what those plans can be and can look like, but I think every general staff, every Minister of Defense has some such contingency plans. And of course, when President Putin threatens to use nuclear weapons, and he does it repeatedly, it doesn't help, to strengthen the non-proliferation regime worldwide, because many countries see now that if you have nuclear weapons, you can use them for to blackmail your neighbors or other countries to get some benefits from them. So it is very interesting fact that nuclear weapons now, thanks to President Putin, now they becoming not the instrument for deterrence as they have been up till now, but they become the instrument of compelling other countries to do whatever you want from them out of the threat of being nuked. So it's totally new level of history of nuclear weapons now. And it is very dangerous, of course, very dangerous development.
The question is, when he threatens to use them, does he mean it? Could he use them?
Well, technically, I think yes. He can order to use them, and I don't think that there will be many generals or other military officers who would say that no, we would not execute these orders because it is like suicide or it is a war crime. I'm afraid there will be people who will say, okay, no problem with that, and they press the button or whatever it is. But whether Putin will use it, it is mostly, I think, it depends not on him, because it depends on how the West, which is the main addressee of this nuclear blackmail, how the West is reacting to that. And for now, I see that this reaction is a bit appeasing. This Western leaders repeatedly say that they don't want any escalation. So they restrict themselves, they restrict their help and assistance to Ukraine. They don't want to supply Ukraine with more powerful, more long-range weapons, for instance, and so on. So they demonstrate at every possible moment, they demonstrate to Putin that they are ready to play by his rules. So he has initiative in this. So, this nuclear game is, first of all, it's psychology game. It's like any blackmail. So if you're confronted with blackmail, you have two options. Either you surrender to this blackmailer and you do whatever he wants from you, or you confront him. To Putin, it all looks like Westerners are very weak and they are not ready to fight, really, to fight for themselves, for peace, and so on. It emboldens him. It encourages him to press further, and he will be pressing further and further until we are all at the moment when he has no other option but to actually use nuclear weapons. So only thing that could prevent from this scenario is to say once and for all that no nuclear threats is acceptable. The West must show its resolve, like UK showed its resolve in 1939 and 1940 when there was a battle for Britain with the Nazis. Yes, then UK didn't surrender. UK didn't appease the aggressor, and the UK prevailed eventually. And the situation now is very similar to what we saw before the Second World War. In the very beginning of the Second World War.
You think we're on the cusp of the Third World War?
Yeah. Well, Putin actually, I think he's sure that he's already waging the Third World War. The world for, to him, it is the world for reshaping the world, the political map of the world, because he believes that he has too little influence, too little power on the map that he is entitled to. And but also we must understand very clearly that Putin and Russia are two different things. When Putin says that something is threatening Russia's interests or Russia's security, he means only himself. Because Russia is totally okay with NATO. Russian people, especially younger generations, they don't see NATO as some kind of an existential enemy or just enemy. No, they're totally okay with that because, well, NATO is a defensive alliance. But for Putin and his generation, who are still, under this Soviet and Cold War era propaganda, they think that they are Russia. So for them, it is a threat to Putin and to his regime.
Mr. Bondarev, just to be clear, what you're saying is that the Allies, the West's attempt at containment of Putin fundamentally misunderstands how he thinks and operates, and that if they don't become more robust and more aggressive in supporting Ukraine to defeat him militarily, then they could help trigger a nuclear war. That's your assessment.
My assessment is that if the West does not show enough strength and resolve to fight back, and by fight back, I mean not necessarily just in militarily fighting, but in general terms, then it will lead to further threats from Putin.
The strategy led by President Biden is to try and avoid escalation, to try and avoid further provoking President Putin. What you're saying is that is a fundamental mistake.
I believe, yes, it is. Because, I mean, when you say that you don't want to provoke a bully, it gives him a wrong signal. He gets it that you're afraid of him and he must continue and escalate further. You must send a clear signal that if Putin wants escalation, he'll get it, and then he will get no incentive to continue because he will see that his threats are not working. He must understand that. Putin may hope that he may change the course of war. He may reverse his defeats into another wide-scale onslaught on Ukraine. And I'm not sure that NATO's help will be sufficient for Ukrainians to defend.
How important is it that President Biden tries to tie in other nuclear powers, tries to tie in China to try and deal with Putin?
Of course, it's necessary to unite as many countries as we can against this aggression. And China is a key player in this because if anyone can influence Putin, that may be President Xi. The problem is that China, I think, is not very much interested in the defeat of Putin, especially by Ukrainians and by Westerns, because now Putin is distracting a lot of attention from the United States, first of all. The attention that they could refocus on China instead. So China, I think, will be very difficult to get China aboard on this anti-Putin coalition or something. But it is necessary, of course. And China and India and all other main key major developing countries. It is very important.
You've worked for much of your career on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. We are where we are. When I listen to you, it frightens me a bit. Do you feel frightened?
Well, of course, nobody wants nuclear war. Because, if we started in some local military theater, it can easily grow into the full-scale world nuclear war, and then we will be surviving in radioactive ruins. But I think we should have this in mind and try to make our best to avoid this scenario. But to avoid this scenario, we cannot avoid it through appeasement and through surrendering ourselves, because it will not cancel this threat. It will just postpone this war, because you cannot surrender indefinitely. Our planet is not that big. So it is if your opponent threatens you with nuclear war, well, you must answer to this.
And you said it's the beginning of the end. You don't know how long that is. We can talk a little bit in a minute about how the end could look like. But he's losing this war, isn't he? When he announced that draft of Russian men drafted in to replete his depleted forces, it's estimated 700,000 Russians fled. He's losing.
Well, for now, yes, it seems so. But again, if the Western world will continue to limit itself in regard of the aid to Ukraine, then the war may still change. And now Russians are bombing the civilian infrastructure, the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. Now, as President Zelensky said, it's 30% of energy infrastructure is out of order. It's a very huge number. So, and with these new Iranian UAVs, very cheap and in great numbers, there are hopes in Russia that they can reverse the course of war. So it is, the war is unpredictable, never goes according to plan on both sides.
Talking about reversing the course of the war, talking about the Iranian drones, the NATO has said that it is going to send in more supplies to try and better help the Ukrainians defend their critical infrastructure. It seems that the tactic of Putin has now moved to raising Ukraine and trying to just destroy all of the infrastructure of the country. Is it enough what NATO's doing? It seems to me that you don't think it is. And so what I'd like you to ask you is, what do you think NATO needs to do now?
To provide the defensive systems to Ukraine, it is very important, of course, there's no doubt, but it is not enough, evidently, because if you only on your defense, then you are doomed to be on defensive forever, and your enemy will have initiative, and it will be able to attack you from any point, any side. And for Ukrainians, it is crucial to have this initiative in the war. And for that, they need offensive weapons. They need tanks, they need more long-range missile systems, and so on. They need aircraft. So I think NATO must double down their efforts and their help.
What you're saying is that you think that NATO allied forces should have a limited deployment of troops to help in the Ukraine war. Maybe be fighter pilots, but there should be some limited deployment.
Well, it's just like food for thought. It's up to military experts of NATO whether they are okay with that or not. But it's first of all about political will of NATO leaders, whether they want to get involved in this or not.
The problem is, as you know, their concern is if they, for example, a no-fly zone, Zelensky's been asking for it again and again and again. You presumably think that they should implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine?
Of course, they don't want to do that because they don't want a direct confrontation with Russia. And it may provoke Putin again to resort to nuclear weapons. But as I'm sure that he will sooner or later do that, unless he is defeated in Ukraine long before he can use nuclear weapons. Something like it is maybe like Russian army in Ukraine just collapses and they flee back home as in some kind of disorganized bands. So, and then there's some internal revolts and turmoils will ensue, of course, in Moscow. So maybe then Putin will not have much time even to give command to use some nuclear weapons, because maybe there will be no one already to execute these orders. But we don't see this situation yet in the front line. And without the successful Ukrainian attacks and offenses, we may not see this year or next spring, for instance. So I just want to reiterate that this massive NATO assistance is crucial.
I'm sure the NATO allies, when they watch this, when people watch it, will hear the message that you think that the West really has to step up and instead of trying to contain Putin, take him on in a more muscular way. My final question to you is, at the beginning of this interview, you said the invasion of Ukraine was the beginning of the end for President Putin. This is probably an impossible question to answer, but how does the end look like for him, do you think? And when do you think this could be over?
First of all, he must lose the war. And as you said, he is now losing it. So if this course of war isn't changed, he will lose it. And nowhere people like their leaders to lose the war, especially in Russia, especially with Mr. Putin, who builds his image as a strong man, as a strong military president, military ruler. So after losing the war, he would have to explain to his elites and to his population why it is so. And he may find some problems in explaining this. And there may be some opposition against it. I say may because we cannot predict it. We can just make our assumptions. But the major factor for his deposing or his downfall will be the losing of the war, of course. And after that, there may be a position who will try to depose him, or he will try to purge his subordinates to find some people who could be blamed for all these problems, and they may revolt against him in turn. So there will be a period of internal turmoil, and I think that's why Putin bets everything on this war, because he evidently planned it to be very short, easy, easy walk into Ukraine for 1-2 weeks, and then Ukraine is conquered, and he has this image of a great liberator and uniter of all ancient Russian lands and so on. Now he has to win it at all costs, and he is already sacrificing hundreds of thousands of his competitors in this, and he will sacrifice millions. You should have no doubts about it. He may sacrifice 10, 20 millions of Russians just to win this war, just to slaughter all Ukrainians, because it's a matter of principle. It's a matter of his political survival for him. He understands that if he loses the war with Ukraine, it will be the end of him. How this end will look like, I cannot say it for now, but I don't think it will be very pleasant for him. But it is, and the West, I think, must be consistent to remove Putin, because while Putin and his regime is still in power in Russia, the threat of war and threat of nuclear war will not go anywhere.
Okay, Boris Bondarev, thank you. It seems to me you're saying that it ends in Putin losing and regime change in Russia. How that happens and over what time frame is still so unclear, but it was so interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time, Boris Bondarev.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for watching. We're going to be off next week, but in the fast-moving news cycle, we'll see you soon again with more interviews and stories from around the world.